For our next watercolor techniques, we're going to learn and try our 6 new ones: glaze, salt, dry brush, splatter, graded wash with color, and blotting. You're going to need all kinds of new supplies for this, so please pay attention to which ones are used where, but we'll get you all set up with those when you get your supplies. Glaze is a 2-step process. So the first thing we do is very simple. We're going to add a layer of paint, just your basic watercolor painting. So I've got it nice and wet, and I paint a color across. Something like glaze is great when you want to add details. Maybe you already painted it blue and now you need to come across and do another color. It's pretty simple, but there's a few things you need to make sure you do. First of all, it's really wet right now. As we keep going, I'll have to check back and make sure it's completely dry before I actually do glaze. Right now, it's just a basic wash, basic painted. Now, salt technique. Salt technique I love for making a texture, kind of little stars or snowflakes. Take your brush, and you want to use quite a bit of water. You want it really wet, and you're going to paint a plain wash again. Just a regular wash. Water. Remember, don't be afraid of water if you're using watercolors. And you want it really wet. See how I can see the paint moving as I move the brush? That means it's nice and wet. If it's not moving very much, you could probably add a little more water. I don't want it dripping. See how that's dripping? It moves around. So I'm going to move that water up to like another corner and spread out that paint. But I do want it able to move. I just don't want it pooling or dripping. Now, like its name, you're going to add regular salt right on top, and we're going to just take a pinch and sprinkle it on. You can see it's already starting to absorb a little bit. The salt has turned like a dark color, and by the end of the video, we should be able to see those stars showing up and brush off the salt to really see what that effect looks like flat on our paper. But that's all you do for salt. Make sure it's really wet or it won't absorb like this. I'll show you that a little later when these are dry. Dry brush, just like it sounds, is when you dry your brush a lot. So my colors should be already wet, like blue. We just added a bunch of water to blue. So I take my brush, I try and wipe off all the water, and I dry my brush on my paper towel, really dry. I like to just pinch it and squeeze out the water. You can tell it's getting dry when the brush starts to separate like this. That means that it's really not sticking together. The water helps it clump together. Then I'm going to come to where there's already the water on there, and you can see it started to come back together again, which is not really what I want. So I'm going to bring it back, try and dry it off a little bit. I don't want to be too rough with it, but really I can press it again, squeeze out the water. But I still want a little paint in there, so make sure you don't dry brush too much. And as you go across, it'll look kind of scratchy. People like to use this a lot to do grasses as well, so I'll do that in a little bit of green for you. But here's an example of if it's just the teeniest bit of extra water on here, and it doesn't look at all the same. It looks like a regular painting technique. So you really need to start out with your brush dry, start out with it dry, squeezing out the water, and dry it off after you add more paint to it. And that'll really help it look scratchy and grassy. It can look kind of like fireworks. You can make it a texture, but if it's clumping together, it's not dry enough. So you really got to be careful. Once it's too wet, it's just not going to show up for you. Dry brush. Splatter is the next one. It's really fun, but really messy, hard to control. So be careful when you're using it. Be careful of other people's projects. You need to warn them before you start this technique. But you're going to splatter your paint. Get my brush really wet. Here's my yellow. I spin it a bunch. I've got lots of yellow on. And you're going to tap it against your finger, trying to splatter in your box. But I can't really control it. I'm not actually hitting the paintbrush on the paper because that would look like my paintbrush. Splattering is when you tap it so that the little droplets fall. It'll take a while to dry too because you're splattering it. So maybe I'll do a little bit of another color. Really wet, splatter. Oh, it's getting into my salt technique. Like I said, hard to control, but it's fun when they mix together and make your splatter. The next one, is graded wash. For this one, I'm gonna start with, how about two colors that wouldn't be next to each other? Let's do like, I'll just do blue and green. So I've got blue on my brush, and I'm going to first, just like graded wash usually is, I do just a line. And then I'm gonna come and add a little bit of the green paint to my brush, just a little bit. And I do another line. And I add just a little bit of the green paint and another line. And I can get a whole spin and another line. And a whole little bit more and another line. And more. And it's turning to totally green. That's what we want to see. Is it going from blue, slowly transitioning to green? I can see kind of a bit of stripes in mine, so maybe I would mix it separately on my palette so that it'd be a little smoother, or add a little more water to kind of smooth it out. But the way that it transitions from blue to green is a graded wash, but it's still with two colors instead of just white and water. The next one is blotting, and this one's really fun, and you guys haven't had much of a chance to try it, but I think you're really gonna like it. Like we did with glaze and salt, it's a plain color underneath. I'm gonna do purple so you can really see it. Plain wash, just regular, basic wash. Lots of color, really wet, good to go. And now, while it's wet, you take a bit of paper towel, a little scrap, and you want to scrunch it up a bit. And you can push it onto your paper and it'll absorb the color away from the paper. People like to use this one a lot to make clouds, other fluffy things. Maybe just to add a little bit of something different, you can use just the corner if you need. If you come back and press even more, it'll get even lighter. You can shape it the way you want. Maybe I want a line of it. But things like that will really change the texture of your project. I like to think of it as clouds if you're doing something with landscapes. It's always a great one to use. Now you've got blotting, graded wash with color, splatter, dry brush. The salt is almost dry. We'll give it a little bit more time while we finish up the glaze. If you touch it and it's cold, cool to the touch, it's not ready. But if it feels like when you touch dry brush is really dry, so it's cooled and dried way faster. This feels really dry, room temperature, and this one does too. Sometimes in spots where it's really wet or areas you just did, it'll be a lot colder, or even a little bit cool means it's not ready. Do not paint while it's wet or cool. It needs to be totally dry. And then you can select any color and you're gonna paint on top. Watercolor paper absorbs your paint, and that's part of why it looks so beautiful and can absorb all this water. But once you've already done a layer, it's not as good at absorbing it. So now I've got yellow, and usually if I painted yellow into green, it's gonna kind of disappear or make it just look yellow-green. But now that it's dry, I should get a nice bold color that kind of sits on top and is shiny. It takes a while to dry, just like the splatter will, because again, it's like sitting on top really chunky. But it can be something to add details or patterns, and even light colors should show up if your glaze is dry enough. But something like that will be a glaze technique when it dries. Now I'm gonna come back to salt really quick, and you can tell where more water was put on top. After you've dropped the salt, you should not be painting on it anymore. Painting on it is gonna ruin the salt. It just makes it like salt water instead of a salt technique where it's absorbing. And then you can brush away the salt, and it leaves this look to your paper without the salt on it. Usually I'd wait the next day to brush off the salt because my fingers are gonna turn the color. But my paper's flat and just has this beautiful starred random texture to it if you've done salt technique correctly. There are your 6 new techniques.